Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikos Tsafos, and I'm the James Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion about a cleaner future for natural gas. We have a distinguished panel with us on the far end of the podium to your left. We have Mr. Anatol Feygin, Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer of Cheniere Energy. Next to him is Dr. Tatiana Mitrova, a visiting research fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Next to her is Mr. Sunao Nakamura, Chief Operating Officer of the Optimization Department of JERA, one of the largest companies in Japan. And next to him and next to me is Mr. Neil Chapman, Senior Vice President at Exxon Mobil. And I'm really excited because we do have a great cross-section of people to talk about this topic. And for those of you who were in the main room earlier, we heard first from the Special Envoy John Kerry about the need for accelerated decarbonization and increased ambition to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And then following that, we heard a panel about how to reconcile those imperatives of decarbonization with the needs of energy security in today's world. And so that's very much the backdrop for this conversation. We conceptualized and put together this panel in the before times, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February. And so obviously the world has changed since we put together and thought about what we wanted to say here. So we wanted to make sure that we continue on that path because there was a reason we wanted to have this discussion. But we also, of course, want to take into account and speak to the incredible images that we're seeing out of Europe and the fundamental shifts that this war is having on the energy market. So our conversation today is really motivated by some very basic facts which are familiar to some of you, if not all of you. Natural gas is one of the fastest growing energy sources that we have. It has been a crucial component of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in certain major economies, including the United States. It has also contributed to reduced local air pollution in major cities, including Beijing and other places around the world. And we understand, and all the models tell us, that if we want to achieve our climate objectives over time, natural gas is going to be part of the mix for years and decades to come. But over the last few years in particular, we've also understood one of the liabilities or weaknesses of natural gas, which is natural gas is methane. And as we produce methane and transport it and move it around and bring it to the consumer, some of it leaks, is vented, is not combusted. And those emissions are a major contributor to climate change. We know that methane emissions, not just from the oil and gas sector, but overall, have accounted for about 30% of the warming in overall temperature, in overall temperatures since the Industrial Revolution. So our discussion today is really about, we know we need to be using natural gas, and natural gas has an important role to play, but we also know that for us to continue to do this, and for us to continue to say that natural gas has an important role to play, we also must do right and reduce the emissions intensity of this gas and make sure that we can produce the gas that we consume in as clean a way as possible. This was a long-winded introduction, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to make sure we're all sort of on the same page about what we're trying to accomplish here. And so with that, we have a great panel with us, and one of the reasons we're very excited about the composition of this panel is because we have people that can speak to different aspects of this topic from different geographies, different perspectives in terms of consumers, producers, and also we have, 3 representatives of companies We heard on the earlier panel, particularly from the president and CEO of Total, that at the end of the day, someone has to sign a contract, someone has to make business decisions. So it's always important to ground these policy conversations into the realities of the commercial world. So with that very long introduction, let me begin on the far end with you, Mr. Feigen. The company you represent, Cheniere Energy, is the largest LNG exporter from the United States, one of the largest LNG exporters globally. It has emerged to take that position in recent years. And as you've assumed this leadership position in the world, you've also made very big moves in measuring, monitoring, disclosing information about the emissions intensity of your gas. You're out there talking more and more about it. You're sponsoring studies and so on and so forth. So maybe I can start with you with sort of a two-part question. First, why are you doing all this? And maybe in answering that, help us sort of ground the conversation. But also tell us a little bit, what exactly are you doing and why it's important?
Thank you. Thanks, Nikos, and wonderful to be here in these very challenging times. And thank you to our hosts, both the nation and CSIS. We started in this business with a very different model and different value proposition, and we, in building a facility that did not have a resource behind it, became not only the largest U.S. exporter of LNG, we also became the largest U.S. buyer of molecules and largest transporter of those molecules. And very early on, even though we've only been operating for a little over 6 years, we realized that we have an outsized responsibility that is frankly enlightened self-interest in preserving our social license to operate for decades and decades to come. We are firm believers in the role of natural gas and LNG in solutions that will help the world decarbonize. But as Nico said, in order to do that, we have to ensure that our product has the lowest emissions profile it can have. We also realized very early on that we didn't have great answers. We as a country, we as a system, really lacked the precision and the measurement and the transparency that Nikos mentioned that we are working on now, quite in earnest through a series of studies, partnerships, developments. We are partnering with 5 of our upstream producer partners. On any given day, we transact with about 70 producers. 5 of the largest we've chosen to partner with in performing the evaluation and measurement of different technologies, not only to figure out what the emissions profile is, but also to assess which technology should be deployed more broadly. Same system being deployed now for the infrastructure, compressor stations, pipelines, as well as with our shipping partners downstream of our facilities where we transact quite often on a delivered basis, and we're implementing those measurement techniques on vessels across our fleet. So all of this is being done to get the information, assess the technologies, create the baselines, and focus efforts going forward on how to best decarbonize and reduce the emissions of our life cycle. And as Nikos mentioned, one of the things that we unveiled last year is the first of its kind peer-reviewed life cycle analysis for our Sabine Pass project, the first one of the 2 that we started in Louisiana. So we think this will guide us and our industry. This will allow us to have the right roadmap, and we are very optimistic that over the coming decades, that system will dramatically reduce its life cycle emissions. But we're starting off at a point where we simply lack the technology and lack the data to make those decisions today. So that's our immediate effort, and we're quite optimistic that it'll bear great fruit for, again, decades to come.
No, thank you. Thank you for that, and for also providing that backdrop for the conversation. I definitely want to come back to a few things that you said on, the measurement, getting the data right, but also maybe come back to you on, what's the response you're getting from the people that you're selling gas to. So maybe we can come back to that. But let me go next to Dr. Mitrova. We wanted you on this panel to speak about the perspective of the Russian oil and gas industry. And obviously, when we first sent you an invitation, the Russian oil and gas industry was a very different industry than it is today. And in the world that we live in, thinking about the future of the Russian oil and gas industry is incredibly difficult because so much depends on the trajectory of this war and how it's going to play out. But maybe we can start off, if you could give us a grounding of how this industry was thinking about these questions sort of before the war. What was the baseline conversation that was happening, the pressures, the interests, the strategies that were employed by different companies in Russia to approach this problem? Maybe we can start there.
Yeah, thank you, Nikos. And, you know, a couple of months ago, we had a conversation with the International Energy Agency on methane emissions. And I was telling them, look, guys, that could become a very painful conflict point potentially. So let's try to discuss how to frame it, because I see from the Russian side very strong opposition to the IEA framework and a lot of criticism. But frankly, yeah, I couldn't imagine that we will end up in such a conflict. Right now it's really difficult to talk about longer term consequences because everything is changing so fast. Every day we get new news and they are more and more frightening and you know, just unbelievable sometimes. But basically, Russia had already methane regulation since early 1990s. It was one of the few countries in the world where they were reporting, there were penalties for methane emissions, not as greenhouse gas, but as a poisoning gas. And that was the reason for the representatives of the Russian Federation to say that we are fine, everything is settled, it is under control. The problem is that the data on the scale of these emissions was like 10 times lower than everything that IEA, for example, or all these satellite assessments were providing. So such a huge gap. It needed some more explanation and disclosure. And here we come to the most painful part of the story, Anatol. As you've mentioned, data is the key, data and certification, because so far, I mean, all the oil and gas companies in Russia, they were publishing their annual sustainability reports. Very nice, yeah. And these reports were certified by the Big Four normally, yeah. So they were audited. The problem is that the initial data, it was coming from the companies. So the auditors, they were just approving that the calculations based on this data were correct. Yeah, but they cannot double check the initial data. So now I think it will become completely impossible. No third parties, no foreign certification companies or agencies would be allowed to get access to this data. And moreover, all these satellite assessments, they will be obviously regarded as unfriendly, you know, investigations or whatever. So we will not know what are the real emissions. And therefore, all the discussion that we have, it will be just some very draft estimations. Surprisingly, you know, I would expect that this year there will be probably reduction in methane emissions for a very simple reason, because the production will go down. So far it hasn't, but I think it's just a matter of a month or so. Yeah, but specific emissions per unit of oil and gas produced, it will go up definitely, because the operations are less efficient, because the international oil service providers, they are suspending their operations, and because the new technologies will be not available. But these are details currently, and we understand that the technological level of the Russian oil and gas industry is now doomed to deteriorate year after year, slowly, but it's just inevitable. But actually, in the new price environment, in the absolutely new market framework which is evolving right now, when actually the buyers are looking to get any gas available, they are not already that much focused on the carbon footprint, on the methane footprint. Yeah, so it's a different competition, it's a different story, and therefore I'm afraid that incentives for the oil and gas companies to really focus on their emission reductions, they are becoming much lower because there is another very urgent task for them, just to provide energy security. So it's like more fundamental. So in this respect, I'm afraid that the gas industry had two very painful shots during the last month. The first one is the fact that that Russia has demonstrated that it is using gas as a weapon in a very clear, very understandable way. So it is this blackmailing with switching to rubles, which is de facto announcing gas embargo. Yeah? And the second painful hit for the gas industry, for the global gas industry, not just for the Russian industry, it is the fact that there is no longer this focus on cleaner fuel. It is so expensive and the dependency is so huge that actually consumers have no choice. And I'm afraid this flavor around the gas industry will stay there for decades, not just for a couple of years. So that's really very, very pity, but yeah, that's the reality today.
Well, thank you, Tatiana, for that. You know, you said a few things that I would love to come back to. I think, you know, you underscore the question of data and measurement, and I do want to come back to that and make sure we talk about it. But I think that question about whether in a moment of acute energy insecurity, you know, companies look at other things and the methane intensity and the cleanliness of the gas becomes a second or third priority or fourth priority. That's something that I definitely want to come back to. And if we have time, I also, where you ended up on, which is, you know, in a moment of immense insecurity and high prices, people may turn away from the fuel altogether, right? They may decide that this is not a good business to be in. And I think that's a great segue for our next speaker, Mr. Nakamura from JERA. JERA has set a zero CO2 emissions target for 2050. It has not put specific plans on the table on sort of methane and methane intensity. And so I wanted to ask you, you know, how you think of the role of gas in the future of JERA, but also sort of building up on the last comment that we heard. You know, one of the things that we always hear from JERA and from other Asian customers is, you know, methane intensity could be one part of a complex calculation of how you make decisions. So I would love to hear more from you on, you know, help us put methane intensity and emissions in the broader context of how you decide what gas to buy as a company.
Well, thank you very much, Nikos, for the question. Well, as for JERA, well, natural gas, or in particular LNG, well, remains to be a primary source for us for at least, I think, well, my personal view is at least for a decade, yeah? Well, because we have a obligation to ensure the stable supply of power and gas to our customers, and we are unable to change our generation assets in one night. Well, it's quite unpractical for us to take a extreme action, yeah. And as a supplier of power and gas to domestic market, the methane emission is quite minimal in midstream and downstream. So, well, the policy we are now taking is to expect the future technological innovation and take a stable step towards the net zero in 2050. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I definitely want to come back and talk about technological innovation, both on the methane front, but also, of course, on the broader energy system and the evolution of natural gas over time. let me turn to you, Mr. Chapman. Exxon Mobil, set a target for net zero by 2050. When that came out, there was a lot of emphasis on we didn't want as a company to set a target until we knew how to do it and started to have more confidence in the ability to do that. And of course, 2050 is a long time away, but you've set much more ambitious target for the near term, for 2030 in particular, and especially for some of your operations in the United States. Can you walk us through kind of how you're thinking about the methane intensity of the gas that you produce within the broader context of your portfolio and your long-term ambitions?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Nikos. We actually don't see a conflict between production rates and reducing methane and methane intensity. And we're enormously proud of the organization because we set a target a few years ago to reduce our methane intensity by 50% by 2025. And we said to the organization, there are practices out there that we know we can all do. Locate emission sources, change equipment where there is leaks, reduce venting, reduce flaring. And the organization, I would say, over-delivered because we achieved that target in 2021. So it's 4 years ahead of what we thought. And it allowed us, or it gave us the confidence to set a new target for 2030, which is a 70 to 80% reduction in methane intensity versus 2016. And what we have done is we've gone to every asset that we operate around the world and developed what we call an abatement curve. So it's an abatement curve to take all emissions from today to net zero. And you do that in every asset. And we did that in all of the assets in the United States. And just to illustrate the scale of that activity, we did 23,000 methane leak surveys on 9,500 assets. So we really get into the detail. And once you have that abatement curve by each individual asset, of course you can consolidate that across the world. It allows you to prioritize what I would call the low-hanging fruit. The assets where you can take out and reduce the emissions much faster. Obviously, some of it's going to be more expensive, but by having that model available for all our operated assets, we can see a line of sight to get to net zero. And that's why we went forth and said we are setting this target of net zero by 2050. In our largest operations in the United States, which is the Permian operations, we actually set a different target. We said we're going to get to net zero by 2030. And the reason we're doing that is because we have a clear line of sight to get there. We set standards on emissions and leaks. We perform monitoring at a ground level. We use drones, we use aircraft, we use satellites. We're targeting to eliminate 100% of routine venting and flaring. We're electrifying all of our drilling and fracking operations. In fact, we've already done that now. And once you've electrified, it gives you the opportunity to convert that electrical power to renewable or net zero power. And so again, we have a clear line of sight, eliminate the emissions, eliminate routine venting, electrification, and then use renewable power or net zero power to provide the power to the facilities. So it's an integrated plan. But the plan is based on the confidence we have because the organization has responded and already made a very, very significant impact in lowering the emissions.
Thank you for that great exposition. I do want to come back to you when we kind of go around to reflect also a little bit on the regulatory environment, right? Because everything you described it as sort of an internal process. And so I think it will be wonderful to hear more from you on the interaction between what you're doing and what governments are asking you to do. But let me go back to you, Mr. Feigin, on there's an underlying assumption that is guiding your principle or your strategy, which is that having a cleaner gas would be a differentiator, right? That at some point the market is sort of going to value this commodity that right now it's all the same, but eventually we'll be able to differentiate. Can you walk us through, where do you see that conversation going? What are the customers telling you when you're showing up with these statements on emissions from the cargoes, and you're saying, I can verify some of these numbers? And maybe as you answer that question, how does that conversation differ depending on who you're talking to or where in the world you're speaking?
Thanks, Nikos. Yeah, to combine a couple of the comments, obviously the comments you heard from Neil about Exxon and its leadership role that it has taken, especially in U.S. onshore infrastructure and production. And we have, again, the benefit of working with dozens and dozens of producers. Even 2 years ago, I don't have data for 21 yet, but in 2020, over 3/4 of the producers that we interact with had their own climate goals and objectives. I don't know what the number is for that percentage 3 or 4 years ago, but I guarantee you it was a small fraction of that. Like, the dialogue has unquestionably evolved. To your question of downstream customers, it is a very wide range, as you would expect. As Tatiana mentioned, there are pure kind of security of supply. We need the molecules with absolutely no dimension of the emissions profile. And there are transactions that we have consummated over the last year and a half that simply would not have been possible without the commitments that we've made. And Nikos was kind enough to mention our commitment of a year ago to, starting this year, provide the emissions profile for every cargo that we ship from our Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi facilities. That information will be, it will be a start, it'll be transparent. Every cargo will have this unique footprint that will go with it. But again, as I touched on earlier, and I think all of us mentioned, the quality of that data will have to continue to improve, and we will ensure that it continues to improve, be more precise, more real time, more reflective of that specific cargo. We fully expect that the industry will head in that direction. And we've been saying for years that we, as a buyer, as the largest physical buyer of gas in North America, don't expect to pay a premium for these commitments and this production profile, nor do we expect to charge a premium for this product. We think this is just the direction that the industry has to go in, from a period of focusing on production growth, often to the detriment of capital formation and likely environmental metrics, to now being a much more disciplined producer, both in terms of economic metrics as well as environmental profile. So we think this is just the natural evolution of the gas value chain, and again, we think that the way Cheniere benefits from this is extending our runway from decades and decades to, centuries and beyond.
You've mentioned data quality on both of your answers so far, and I want to come back to that eventually, because I also want to loop in the regulatory environment as well as technology, right? Because those are sort of the two key drivers for trying to get better data quality. But with that, let me turn to Dr. Mitrova. One of the elements that we knew sort of before the war that was driving the Russian strategy on methane was, what the European customers were saying, the European methane strategy. And if we think of a Russia that is not as much looking at the European market to sell its hydrocarbons, particularly if we see more of an Asia focus with its limits, of course, you know them better than anyone, the limits of being able to switch. Is there enough sort of internal momentum in Russia to talk about the methane intensity of the hydrocarbons, or would you think that that was largely externally determined and in response to external pressures, and therefore, if you're going to be switching to China, maybe no one is asking you anymore? Could that be a fate for the Russian hydrocarbon industry?
Yeah, I suspect that it is very close to the truth. Indeed, the whole disclosure and the whole focus on methane, it was primarily driven either by the international investors, because they are demanding all this information on broader ESG issues, including climate and including methane emissions specifically. So financial community, international financial community, which is now completely switched off from Russia legally, yeah. Customers, and indeed, Anatol, I would agree, it is very important to understand. I was talking with the different Russian companies, and they were all saying, both for oil and gas, that they couldn't find the premium for green oil or green gas. It is, they had to invest some time and efforts to really build up this whole system of certification and disclosure, but the premium could hardly cover these additional investments. And they were all thinking in the same paradigm, that it is rather license to operate for the future, like, you know, this energy efficiency labeling on any equipment. You simply cannot sell without that. So it is something which will become obligatory sometime soon, yeah, and they were preparing for that. Right now, I mean, when the whole structure of a relationship, the whole contractual structure, everything is like exploding completely. It's very difficult to say how will this component of carbon footprint and methane emissions disclosure find its place in the new relationship, if there will be any with the European customers. I assume that there will be, simply because otherwise the math doesn't match. Yeah? With the Asian buyers, I think that, again, Japan doesn't change its attitude towards methane emissions. So it could be only China, and I'm not that couraged to be able to project how China will behave here, because there are also very controversial signals coming. There were several important contracts for pipeline gas supplies signed recently. So there was one for 10 billion cubic meters from Sakhalin, signed during Olympic Games at Beijing. Yeah, we didn't understand what happened, but now I think there are many conspiracies around that. And actually on February 28th, Gazprom has announced that it has initiated technical study for the Vostok-Soyuz project, which is renamed former Altai project, bringing pipeline gas from Western Siberia to China through Mongolia. And this project is supposed to be really huge. So if we put together existing power of Siberia 1, this Altai project, this Sakhalin project, theoretically by 2030 there could be like 100 billion cubic meters of Russian gas flowing to the Asian, to China basically. And the key question is whether China will demand any disclosure and reduction of methane emissions for all this quite considerable amount of gas.
No, thank you for that. I think the question of Russia's ability to make that turn, as well as, of course, China's appetite for it. I'm not sure if anyone is looking at Russia today and thinking, I want to be more dependent on these guys. So it will be interesting to see what the Chinese appetite is. And I'm going to come back to you when we go around on sort of, with all the uncertainties, kind of the future of the Russian industry, because I think part of the challenge that we're grappling with is that a Russia that is more isolated, where there's less investment, there's less technological change, is also probably going to be a Russia that's not innovating a lot, it's not introducing new technologies, and therefore not decarbonizing as much for a country that is a major emitter. So maybe we'll come back to you on that. Mr. Nakamura, let me pose you sort of the flip side that I posed to Shanir, because you're the customer, and so companies are coming to you and they're saying, I have a carbon neutral LNG, I have a cleaner LNG. JERA was one of the companies that did a carbon neutral LNG, one of the first sort of transactions. You know, how do you think about that world when people come to you and they give you sort of the methane intensity of the gas? Is it sort of a nice thing to have? Does it shape your decisions? Clearly, as we just heard, no one is quite ready to pay a premium for this. At the end of the day, it's just a commodity. But maybe give us sort of the buyer's reaction from what the sellers are out there selling.
Well, my sense is that it's a bit premature to answer with regards to the methane emission about the commercial condition of natural gas or LNG. Well, we do have a sense that greenhouse gas, or the issue of greenhouse gas or the global warming has been attracting a larger attention. And I believe that the control of methane emission is now more important. And as a buyer of LNG or natural gas, this issue is something we cannot ignore. Well, in the past, until a few years ago, most of LNG transactions were under the long-term contract. And with long-term contracts, we had we still have some long-term relationship. And under the long-term relationship, from buyer's perspective, it was easier to monitor the supplier's activity. But nowadays, there are more short-term or spot transactions in LNG, and destinations are now diverse. I mean, more cargoes go to more LNG receiving terminals. So it's quite difficult to understand or to capture the supplier's action. So I think we need to establish or create the rule of monitoring and reporting, and we should have the information transparency with regards to this methane emission issue. Thank you.
Let's talk about getting the numbers right and getting greater confidence in that. And I want to ask sort of a multi-part question, because what I really want to get at is that's the goal. We get it. We need to have good data that can compare like with like, that everyone can agree, and it's not like, I verify that you multiplied 3 by 4 correctly, but I have faith in the 3 and the 4. Which is the important thing. And so, broadly speaking, we see 2 types of forces shaping better data: technology and regulation. And so I wanted to begin on, you talk to us about the technology side of things, at least internally at Exxon Mobil, and what you're doing. But walk us through how you're thinking of sort of what's coming from government forces in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency released a very extensive sort of set of rules and guidelines for methane. But also the technology, most of what you described, was falling on the reducing methane emissions, maybe less on the monitoring and on the verification. So big question, how do we get the numbers right with a focus on regulation and technology? And I'm going to ask the same question to you, Mr. Feigen, at the end of this. So,
well, thank you. Our view on the regulation is there are best practices in the industry today which are all about the operations integrity, the license to operate, as you talked about earlier on, which are simple to do and which can drive down the emissions immediately. So we've been a strong advocate of a regulatory framework that applies those best practices. It is not complicated. It's about minimizing flaring. It's about eliminating equipment where you do know they have leaks. Our feeling is very strongly that if you have a regulatory framework that pushes the industry down the curve to reduce emissions, we shouldn't wait for perfection on measurement technology. We should implement those best practices now. And so we've been an advocate in the US and in Europe of putting a regulatory framework in place that reflects those best practices. And we believe both Asia, both regions are working on that framework, and we think it's a sensible thing to do. We work through the Methane Guiding Principles Group, which of course is an association of industry and NGOs and academia, to try and spread that philosophy, that concept around the world. Because we think it's a very simple thing to do that any company can do. Now, to go to the measurement, of course, the technology is evolving very rapidly. And what we can see today is we can identify leaks much better than we've ever done historically. And as I said earlier, either through land-based monitoring, or through drones, or through satellites, or through flyovers. But you can't calculate them. That technology is still to be perfected. We think it will be perfected. We think we will have better measurement and quantification in the future. But what we don't think is that you shouldn't stop the program now. You can go a long way down the curve of reducing emissions without getting perfection on the measurement of emissions.
Mr. Fagan.
Very similar answer to Neil's. We Cheniere have been supportive of the methane rules throughout administrations, and we think that those are great for our industry. And the challenge there, as Neil said, is that regulation needs to be built on high-quality information. And so now industry has responded. I can't say that not a day goes by, but I can say that not a week goes by without some technology provider reaching out to us asking for its technology to be evaluated as part of our processes. And we have multiple technologies that are deployed in these various QMRV protocols that we are evaluating. And as Neil said, we're very optimistic that the industry will respond very quickly and will adopt a series of these technologies. The solutions for a production pad are going to be different than solutions for pipelines or compressor stations, and there will be multiple technology providers that ultimately the upstream, midstream, liquefaction, and shipping industries will use. That will lead to even better regulation, and we're very supportive of that because, again, we think that is in the best interest of the industry overall. So it's a huge focus. I will say that the industry was really at a standstill on this front just a couple of years ago. So it has ramped up very quickly, and we're very optimistic that in the coming quarters, or at the most years, it'll be very broadly deployed. The economics of deploying these technologies relative to the economics of production, transportation, liquefaction, shipping of natural gas are minuscule. So it's not a barrier from a cost standpoint. It is a barrier today from a knowledge base and technology availability standpoint.
Thank you. Thank you both for that exposition. I already cued my question to you, Dr. Mitrova, on sort of thinking about the future of the industry and its ability to innovate and evolve over time, again, with the enormous asterisks and caveats that we have no idea what the future holds at this current moment. But is that also a fair assumption to make, that Russia is more isolated, less willing and able to adopt new technologies and drive its own decarbonization? How would you think about that?
You know, there are very controversial signals coming from Russia on this matter. So first of all, obviously, we all realize that sanctions are really making technological cooperation impossible. Yeah, so in this respect, with the new technologies, now Russia will have to rely only on itself, maybe to a certain extent cooperation with China, maybe with Iran, North Korea, I don't know. Yeah. But Russia, differently from many other countries, has very strong engineering expertise still. Yeah, and I was observing how it was reacting to the sanctions imposed in 2014, which were quite mild, to be frank, maybe too mild. Yeah. Actually, it has developed some of the catalyzers which were missing. It has developed its own liquefaction, natural gas liquefaction technology, not reliable, not really efficient, but it works. Yeah, in this situation of isolated economy, you are not thinking about efficiencies, you are not thinking about carbon footprint. It just should work somehow. Yeah, and the same with hydrofracking. The same with some software needed for operations. So there will be some technologies evolving, and there are already statements from the state that we will fund it, that we will support it, we will not allow IT specialists to leave the country. Yeah, that was announcement today. There is some competence and capability, but I don't think, frankly, that this competence will be focused on the technologies of energy transition. Because when your volumes of exports of oil and gas and coal are limited by the lack of external demand, you have this huge bubble of hydrocarbons in the domestic market, which means that there is absolutely no incentive to reduce emissions, to reduce the usage of fossil fuel, and to develop definitely more expensive solar, wind, hydrogen, or whatever. So I think that there will be very significant slowdown in the development, if not termination at all, in the development of the green technologies, in decarbonization of oil and gas. But at the same time, most likely, surprise, surprise, there will be a reduction in absolute volumes of emissions. Because with a projected 20% reduction in GDP, the overall emissions will also go down. So it's a very controversial picture. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Novak says that we will still stay with the announced goal of net zero by 2060. Russian Ministry of Economic Development says that no way to achieve that. Yeah, so I think the position is not yet defined, and most likely, of course, the primary focus will be simply on the survival, not on the development now.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Nakamura, let me come back to you. You've mentioned sort of technology and technological evolution a couple of times, and so I was wondering if you could talk not just on methane, but just on the role of natural gas and the different technologies that you see towards zero CO2 emissions evolving over time. It seems to the outside eye that you're going to achieve these targets through going into hydrogen and ammonia and diversification of technologies, maybe more so than focusing on the methane intensity of the gas molecules that you are buying currently. Is that a fair assumption? How do you see that portfolio evolving of technologies over time for JERA?
Well, as I said, that the methane emission is quite minimal in energy sector in Japan. I mean, 3/4 of methane emission comes from agriculture. I think this ratio may be different. I mean, largely different from one country to another, as Japan is not a energy producing country. Yeah. And well, energy resource is quite, scarce in Japan. And we do have to take multiple ways to reach net zero in 2050. I mean, we cannot solely rely on renewables. I mean, hydro resource is quite limited, and wind power does not, it's difficult for wind power to find out the appropriate locations. So what we are now trying to do is to introduce hydrogen and in particular ammonia to our fossil fuel power generation assets. Well, instead of using coal, oil, or natural gas in the future, instead, the plan is to introduce ammonia and other hydrogen type resource or fuel to generate power and to secure the stable supply to our domestic market. Yeah, but it takes some time, I mean, not a few years, to secure enough volume of ammonia to our market. So this is quite a long way to go. Yeah.
Absolutely, and how to build the hydrogen economy, I think, is one of the biggest questions we face, perhaps our topic for Doha Forum 21, that we can reconvene to talk about that. Mr. Chapman, let me finish with you, and if I could benefit from sort of the broader perspective that ExxonMobil brings as one of the leaders in the energy sector, you know, how do you see this conversation that we just had changing because of the war and because of the immense pressures of energy security? I mean, are we at a moment where, you know, we're just going to scramble and get whatever cargo we can get and whatever molecule we can get and forget about methane intensity? And if that's the case, does that last for, you know, 6 months? Does it reset things? You know, how are you thinking about, you know, ExxonMobil is one of the companies that always sort of prides itself in thinking about the structural drivers of the energy system and where the ship is going overall, not the wave of the day, but help us think through how you're weighing this current moment for the conversation we just had.
Yeah, there's a lot of points in that question, and so I'll focus on gas if that's okay. And first, let me just say, like everyone else, we deplore what's happening in Ukraine, and we're deeply, deeply saddened by the loss of life and the loss of infrastructure in the country. But I think we all have to realize that going into the war, the gas market was really, really tight. The spot prices in Europe and Asia, $30, $35, reflected how tight the market is. And this really goes back to the growing demand and the lack of additional capacity. And it gets out of balance. And the biggest challenge you have in gas, it takes years to add new capacity. And that's what's underestimated. So going into the crisis, the markets were already tight. And what that means is the consumers, they couldn't rebuild the inventories. So going into the crisis, the gas inventories in Europe were already below the 5-year range. And of course, Europe relies on 30% or 30% plus of their gas coming from pipelines from Russia. If that doesn't flow, where is the gas going to come from? There isn't additional LNG capacity in the world today. Because prices were so high, all of those facilities were running full. And there isn't a lot of new capacity in reality coming online for the next 2 years. They're relatively small increments. And it begs that question that in the industry we've talked about so much, which we call this dual challenge, which is supplying the world's growing energy needs, which is a critical security issue for nations, at the same time as addressing the challenges of climate change. And we think managing that transition is going to be absolutely critical for anybody, any country. And if you put all your eggs in one basket, as they say, and you back one technology and you don't have the security, optionality, diversity of supply in your energy mix, of course that becomes a risk management issue. And that's what we're faced with today. But at the root of it comes to this imbalance between the supply and the demand. And over the last 2 years, and of course that was exaggerated by COVID, you know, we have long been saying there is not enough investment in this industry. We all want to get to net zero. We've just got to be very sensible managing the transition. And I think what's happening today, highlighted by the supply-demand situation in Europe, really reflects the challenges we have. We have to manage the transition very, very carefully. We strongly believe that natural gas will be pivotal fuel supply for the world in the coming years. But to get back to the point of your question, we think the industry was tight going into this situation, and it's likely to remain tight in the coming few years.
Well, I hope you can all see why I was so excited for this conversation. We had just a tremendous wealth of knowledge on this panel. And so thank you, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.